In 1926, the American aviation industry existed as a collection of fragmented mail routes and experimental technology. Harold Pitcairn, a Pennsylvania based inventor and aircraft manufacturer, saw an opportunity to stabilize his business through the federal government's privatization of airmail. He successfully bid for Contract Airmail Route 19, a path linking New Jersey to Atlanta. This specific route served as the geographic foundation for what would eventually become the Eastern Network for more than half a century. To service his contract, Pitcairn's company designed the Mail Wing. The aircraft was a sturdy single-engine biplane built for the utilitarian task of moving heavy mailbags through the difficult weather conditions of the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic coast. The pilots who flew these routes operated in open cockpits and relied on landmarks and bonfires for navigation. At this stage, the business focused purely on logistics. Passenger comfort was non-existent because the revenue lived in the mailbags, not in the seats. The trajectory of the operation shifted in 1929 when Clement Keyes, the head of North American Aviation, purchased Pitcairn Aviation for $2.5 million. Keyes was a financier with a vision for a massive aviation conglomerate, and he immediately rebranded the carrier as Eastern Air Transport. This change in name reflected a new ambition to move people across the East Coast. By the early 1930s, the company began integrating passenger service into its existing mail infrastructure using larger multi-engine aircraft like the Curtiss Condor. This period of expansion involved acquiring smaller regional carriers and pushing the route network further south into Florida. The transition was often chaotic as the company had to learn how to manage actual people instead of just sacks of letters. The modern identity of the company finally crystallized following the airmail scandal of 1934. The federal government mandated a separation between aircraft manufacturing and airline operations, leading to the official birth of Eastern Airlines. It was during this restructuring that Eddie Rickenbacker began his rise to power. Rickenbacker took control of a company that already possessed the most valuable route network in the country. He inherited a functional, battle-tested system and applied a level of rigid military discipline that turned a rugged mail carrier into a commercial empire. Eddie Rickenbacker's arrival as the head of Eastern Airlines in 1938 initiated a period of extreme operational discipline. He'd spent his career in the cockpits of fighter planes and behind the wheel of racing cars, and he brought that same mechanical exactness to the corporate office. His management style prioritized one specific metric: the bottom line. Every decision within the company served the goal of moving passengers with the absolute minimum amount of overhead. This meant a complete rejection of the luxury amenities that were becoming common at other major carriers. From his perspective, the purchase of a ticket entitled a passenger to a seat and a destination, and anything beyond that was an unnecessary distraction from the core mission of the company. This frugality became the defining characteristic of the Great Silver Fleet. The iconic appearance of the Douglas DC-2 and DC-3 aircraft was the result of a cold financial calculation. Paint was heavy. Adding a full cone of paint to a transport plane added hundreds of pounds to the airframe, which directly increased fuel consumption and reduced the available payload. By polishing the aluminum skin to a mirror finish, Rickenbacker saved on fuel and maintenance while simultaneously creating a visual brand that was recognizable at any airport in the country. It was a rare instance where a strict cost-cutting measure actually enhanced the prestige of the airline. These silver planes weren't the most comfortable options in the sky, but they were remarkably consistent. Rickenbacker understood that his most valuable product was the schedule, particularly on the high-demand routes between the industrial north and the vacation hubs of Florida. Eastern's grip on the East Coast corridor provided the company with a level of financial security that few other airlines could match. The airline dominated the flight paths between New York and Miami, which stood as the most profitable stretch of airspace in the world. For decades, the company faced minimal competitions on these routes, allowing it to solidify its status as one of the Big Four domestic carriers. The massive revenue from these runs funded a period of rapid expansion, but the internal culture remained anchored in the 1930s. Rickenbacker was an uncompromising leader who expected total military-style loyalty from his staff. He'd often show up at maintenance hangars in the middle of the night to personally inspect the work of his mechanics. While this hands-on approach kept the airline running with incredible precision, it also created deep-seated friction. By the end of the 1940s, Eastern was an industrial titan, but it was a titan built on a very specific set of circumstances. The business relied on government-protected routes and a lack of real consumer choice. Rickenbacker's refusal to invest in passenger comfort or modern marketing didn't hurt the company as long as Eastern held the exclusive keys to the Florida market. However, this success masked growing internal problems. The airline's heavy handed management and its refusal to adapt a more service oriented industry were starting to alienate both the employees and the customers. It was a period of record profits and unmatched market power, but the foundation of the Great Silver Fleet was more fragile than it appeared on the surface. The 1950s moved Eastern Airlines into a period of fierce competition that challenged the company's long-standing refusal to prioritize passenger comfort. While the airline still held a dominant position on the East Coast, the rise of national airlines turned the New York to Miami corridor into a corporate battlefield known as the Blue Ribbon Route. National marketed a high-end star service that featured red carpets and luxury meals, which stood in direct opposition to the sparse bus-style services that Eddie Rickenbacker preferred. To stay relevant, Eastern had to pivot away from its strictly utilitarian roots. This era saw the introduction of the Golden Falcon service, a premium brand designed to match the opulence of the competition. The airline began investing in the Lockheed Constellation, a pressurized four-engine aircraft with a distinctive triple-tail design that allowed for faster, smoother flights above the weather. The Connie became the new face of the fleet, representing a level of prestige the old DC-3s simply couldn't provide. Despite the shift towards luxury, the internal management at Eastern remained focused on high-frequency operations. The company utilized its fleet of Constellations and later DC-7s to overwhelm the market with sheer volume. During the mid-1950s, Eastern operated more flights between the Northeast and Florida than any other carrier, often scheduling departures every half hour during peak seasons. This strategy of saturation helped the airline maintain its market share, but it also required a massive increase in maintenance and staffing costs. The complexity of the new piston engines meant the Great Silver Fleet was becoming significantly more expensive to keep in the air. Rickenbacker's legendary frugality was being eroded by the technical demands of the late prop era and the rising expectations of a more affluent traveling public. The tension between the old guard management and the new realities of the industry reached a breaking point as the jet age approached. While Eastern was still profitable, the board of directors began to realize that Rickenbacker's hands-on paternalistic style was increasingly out of step with a rapidly modernizing world. The airline spent the late 1950s caught in a state of transition yet again, trying to balance its reputation for reliability with the need for a more contemporary image. The Golden Falcon branding was a successful temporary fix, but the arrival of the first commercial jets from competitors like Pan Am and National signaled that the era of majestic propliners was ending. This period of the 1950s set the stage for the massive financial gamble of the 1960s as the company prepared to retire its Constellations and enter the high-stakes world of jet propulsion. By the early 1960s, Eastern Airlines had successfully moved past the rigid no-frills philosophy of the Rickenbacker era and began investing in the next generation of aviation technology. The primary instrument for this modernization was the Boeing 727, which the airline marketed as the Whisperjet. The aircraft was a perfect fit for a network that relied on high-frequency, short to medium-haul routes across the East Coast. It possessed the performance to operate out of smaller airports like New York's LaGuardia while carrying a passenger load that made the economics of frequent departures work. For the first time, Eastern possessed a fleet that was both technologically advanced and remarkably efficient, allowing the company to dominate the skies from Montreal to Miami. This period also saw a complete visual refresh for the brand. In 1965, the airline introduced the hockey stick livery, featuring a dual-tone blue cheat line in Caribbean blue and an ionosphere blue that swept up the tail. The most significant operational shift of the decade occurred on April 30th, 1961, with the launch of Eastern Air-Shuttle. The service redefined the relationship between the airline and its most frequent travelers by removing the friction of the traditional boarding process. The concept focused on simplicity, hourly flights between New York, Washington, and Boston with no reservations required. Passengers simply showed up at the gate, took a seat, and paid for their ticket on board. To ensure the service's reliability, Eastern maintained a fleet of backup aircraft at each station. If a scheduled flight reached capacity, the airline guaranteed a seat for every remaining passenger by rolling out an extra plane, even if it meant flying a single passenger on a dedicated jet. This commitment turned the Air-Shuttle into a vital utility for the political and financial centers of the country, making Eastern an indispensable part of the American economy. As the 1960s drew to a close, the airline's ambition grew alongside its passenger numbers. Eastern became the launch customer for the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, a wide-body jet that represented the absolute cutting edge of aerospace technology. The TriStar featured a sophisticated auto-land system that allowed it to operate in zero-visibility weather, along with a spacious, wide-look cabin that offered a level of comfort previously unseen on the Florida corridor. However, the project became a source of significant financial stress with the engine manufacturer Rolls-Royce and went into bankruptcy in 1971. The resulting delays left Eastern with grounded crews and a fleet that was years behind schedule. When service finally began in April 1972, the airline had already taken on massive amounts of debt to keep the program alive. The passage of the Airline Deregulation Act in 1978 ended the decades of government protection that allowed Eastern to thrive as a regulated monopoly. Suddenly, the Great Silver Fleet had to compete in a wide-open market where new low-cost carriers could fly the same routes without the burden of legacy costs or union contracts. Frank Borman, the former Apollo 8 commander who became CEO in 1975, recognized that the airline's survival depended on a massive modernization of its fleet to combat rising fuel prices. His most famous move was a Hail Mary deal with Airbus, a European company that was desperate to break into the American market at the time. In 1977, Borman negotiated a 6-month trial lease for 4 Airbus A300 wide-body jets for essentially no cost. This gamble was a success as the A300 proved to be significantly more fuel efficient than the older TriStars on shorter hops. Eastern eventually ordered 23 of the aircraft, becoming the first major U.S. carrier to operate an Airbus-made jet. While the new fleet was technologically advanced, the cost of these acquisitions placed a crushing weight on the company's balance sheet. To manage the mounting debt, Borman introduced the Variable Earnings Program, a controversial plan where a portion of employee wages was withheld and only paid out if the airline met specific profit targets. This program helped Eastern achieve some of the most profitable years in its history during the late 70s, but it also created deep-seated resentment among the workforce. The employees felt they were being forced to subsidize management's expensive aircraft purchases with their own paychecks. By the time the Boeing 757 entered service in 1983 with Eastern as the launch customer, the internal culture had become increasingly fractured. The promise of more efficient planes couldn't offset the fact that the airline was now billions of dollars in debt while fighting an aggressive price war with upstarts like People Express. The tension finally reached a breaking point during 1983 during a high-stakes standoff with the International Association of Machinists led by combative Charlie Bryan. Borman demanded deep pay cuts to keep the airline solvent, but the union refused to blink. The trust between the cockpit, the hangars, and the executive offices had completely evaporated. This internal warfare was happening while the airline was still carrying more passengers than almost anyone else, but the profits were vanishing into interest payments and labor disputes. By 1986, the financial situation was so dire that the board of directors saw only one way out. They agreed to sell the airline to Frank Lorenzo and his Texas Air Corporation for $615 million. It was a move that many employees viewed as a betrayal, signaling the end of the Borman era and the beginning of a final aggressive attempt to dismantle the unions and strip the airline's assets. The acquisition by Texas Air Corporation in 1986 immediately turned the daily operations at Eastern into a high-stakes standoff. While Frank Borman had attempted to lead through a sense of shared sacrifice, the new management under Frank Lorenzo viewed the airline through a lens of aggressive consolidation. The workforce, already weary from years of wage concessions, saw the arrival of the new leadership as an existential threat. This suspicion was confirmed as the airline's most valuable assets began to move away from the Eastern balance sheet. The profitable Air-Shuttle was sold to Donald Trump, and the System 1 reservation infrastructure was transferred to Texas Air for a price that many industry analysts considered below market value. These maneuvers effectively stripped the carrier of its financial safety net, leaving the Great Silver Fleet to operate on a hollowed-out foundation. The internal culture at the Miami headquarters and across the maintenance bases became openly hostile, with Stop Lorenzo stickers appearing on everything from luggage carts to cockpit bulkheads. The tension reached a terminal breaking point in March of 1989. The International Association of Machinists initiated a strike that quickly became a total shutdown of the airline. In a move that few expected, the pilots and flight attendants chose to honor the picket lines, grounded by a shared belief that the airline was being dismantled from within. This rare show of labor solidarity effectively killed the company's remaining cash flow overnight. Within days of the walkout, Eastern filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Unlike the reorganization seen at other carriers during this era, this filing felt like a slow motion liquidation. The bankruptcy court eventually stripped Lorenzo of control and appointed Martin Shugru as a trustee to attempt a miracle turnaround. Shugru led the second to none marketing campaign, focused on a return to premium service and a nostalgic appeal to the airline's storied past. For a few months in 1990, the planes were clean, the service was polished, and there was a faint hope that the brand might actually survive. The ultimate collapse was dictated by global events that the airline's fragile recovery plan simply couldn't withstand. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in late 1990 caused jet fuel prices to spike at the exact moment travel demand cratered due to a looming recession. Eastern was losing over $1 million a day, and the creditors who had funded Shugru's turnaround attempt finally ran out of patience. On the night of January 18, 1991, the order went out to all stations to cancel every flight scheduled for the following day. The demise of Eastern Airlines resulted in the loss of 30,000 jobs and the end of a 65-year legacy. It serves as a reminder that in a deregulated sky, even the most dominant industrial giants can be dismantled by a combination of high debt, external shocks, and a total breakdown in the trust required to keep a company flying.